Okay, my beautiful colleagues at Notre Dame. This topic is complex grief. So, grief is a natural process to loss, or natural response to loss, and takes time, patience, and support. It's complex grief is severe, persistent, and disabling, and not just limited to bereavement. So I got in touch with the Grief Centre WA to get clear about the subject because there was many different kind of concepts floating around, which we'll look at in a moment. It's usually due to compounding losses and multiple challenges, and it's often presenting with depression, anxiety, suicidality, attachment issues, anger, substance misuse, and sleep issues. Some combination of those things is very normal. It needs targeted interventions and prolonged support, but here's the good news. It can lead to post-traumatic growth, which is a wonderful phenomenon of kind of evolving through troubles. So lived experience is really valued at the Grief Centre in who they hire and how they support clients. And increasingly, you've noticed it, I think, sort of throughout human services. I have experienced complex grief, which is why I chose the subject, and this obviously informs the presentation. Right, key concepts. We have loss is what we no longer have, and grief is the emotional response to that. So generally around this topic, bereavement is by far the major thing that we hear talked about. However, you'll see in a moment that there are many other losses that can lead to grief and complex grief. So complex grief is an informal term referring to debilitating and non-normative grief, sometimes called complicated grief. So I guess in that way, they're suggesting it's not natural, it's something beyond. However, the underlying assumption is that all grief is natural. So in the DSM, we've got terms like persistent complex bereavement disorder and prolonged grief disorder. So I don't want to get bogged down in the semantics. I'm working with the concept of complex grief, and that's what the Grief Centre looks at. Right, so these are all the types of loss and grief. Have a look and see if you've ever experienced or know somebody who has. As you're looking, I don't want to repeat everything, so we'll just go through the list and then I will disclose to you what I have experienced. And then when you see me walking around being a little bit like, what's today, you might realize that it can affect us. So going back again, in that I've lost both my parents, some very close friends, and several pets. I've been recently divorced. I have experienced infertility, loss of employment and financial security, serious illness, and childhood abuse, and the loss of my home country and culture at various times. Now, this is not about me, but I'm just disclosing that this is the case. And all of that informs the empathy that I feel for those that are going through it. And it obviously requires radical self-care. So we have life transitions. So I've gone through the empty nest and lost a sense of purpose from that. I'm certainly not retired, but that is definitely something that can affect people very severely, particularly when it compounds with the other losses that we've just seen, and the loss of natural environments and species extinction. So my friend Linda Rawlings used to work at the Grief Centre, and she brought that into their work. And indeed, around the world, there are psychologists and counsellors and many others supporting people with this very big aspect of loss, which affects us all, more or less. Well, it affects us whether we realize it or not. And then the intangible losses, the loss of dreams, hopes for the future, which is a biggie and is very underlying in the case study that you will see, and in general with complex grief, as I understand it. So how it presents and the risk factors, let's have a look at that. So in terms of the criteria, we're looking at the duration, not to be prescriptive, but, complex grief may be sort of a term that's used, when something has gone on for months in a severe form, years or even decades after the causal events, the intensity of the emotion, many strong emotions, sadness, anger, it can be overwhelming, longing for the person who has gone or the thing that you have lost, bitterness. And then impairment can be significant in many different areas of life. One thing that seems to be really challenging for people is just not accepting the loss. And you'll see when we move on to therapeutic approaches how significant that is, particularly in the early stages, but recurrently. Rumination, always that monkey mind chewing away, eating itself alive. We want to give clients support with. Social withdrawal is a big one in so many presentations, and certainly in this case. The risk factors include previous trauma, previous suicidality, addiction, insecure attachment style, lack of social support, and I need to clean that slide up. And it can impact mental and physical health in many ways. The Grief Centre have taken on, extra funding for suicidality because it's on the rise, and we all have the compounding factors of what's happening more widely in society and the environment. So the 4 tasks of grief, which is a non-linear kind of summary of not the stages, which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross looks at and has been kind of critiqued, you'll see in the references in the handout, but 4 tasks that can come up again and again. So this is adapted from Warden, and Warden's work was given to me by the Grief Centre. So accepting the reality of the loss, how can you move on from it if you can't accept that it's actually happened? And when we say move on, we don't mean that you should forget the person or the thing that you have lost, but we need to accept that it's gone in order to process it, process the pain. So in the case study, you'll see that particular attention has been given to being with the pain, creating that container with the client and normalizing it. Adjusting to the new world, just being in this new world of whatever is not there anymore, is a major adjustment. And I guess you could look at adjustment disorders in general to understand what's going on here with complex grief. And then embarking on a new life, being willing to actually live anew in this whole new world. And, for me, that was, back in Western Australia after 14 years away, with 1 suitcase at the time. So good old Grief Centre, there's the reference, and that's in the handout. Now, other evidence models, there's quite a few. And one of them comes from Columbia University. It's manualized and standardized, and probably they're making quite a lot of money out of it, I imagine, because it's that form. And that's maybe cynical of me, but there you go. I couldn't share the manual with you because it's copyright. I couldn't even cite it directly, but there is a reference to it in the references. And I guess, semantics aside, complicated grief, complex grief, the reason why I haven't gone into it in detail is because it really looks absolutely primarily at bereavement. And I wanted to be more inclusive of the other losses, because complex grief can arise with or without bereavement. Peer-based grief support interventions I have highlighted because that came up quite strongly in the conversation I had with Hayley Solich at the Grief Centre, and it's all over the place. We're finding that people feel more normal and supported when they have peers, when they have people that have gone through it as well. And that's not manualized or standardized. It's just what we create when we can in the organizations that we're in and the communities that we're in and the relationships that we're in. Yeah, if we share what's happening for us, then others feel more connected and less alone. Meaning and loss therapy is interesting. You can have a look at that. The family bereavement program looks at the wider system. And animal-assisted grief therapy, there you go. I said there'd be a dog, and there's a dog, not a dog running around, but a beautiful therapy dog. And that can be extremely helpful for people of all ages to just have, as we always did for time immemorial, you know, companion animals. Apparently the dogs first came to eat our scraps by the fire and protected us. So there's a very ancient connection to them. They're very soothing, the therapy dogs, not the yappy, nasty little ones. No offense to people with yappy, nasty dogs. Right, grief and trauma intervention for children, very specific approach. If that comes up in your practice, please have a look at that. Now, let's have a look at Bridget. So Bridget is a 50-year-old woman of Irish descent. She's widowed for 3 years with 2 adult children, who left home shortly after Dad died, and she's a first-generation migrant. It was a traumatic bereavement, sudden heart attack with no warning, aged 46. Ian was my life. We've been together since I was 16. So you can imagine, like, how could she possibly make sense of it if it happened very suddenly? And if they've been together, you know, for most of their life, certainly most of their adult life. And of course, he was the major breadwinner. So now she's got that to worry about. The kids have moved on and she doesn't feel they want to hear what she's got to say. And she's been gone from Ireland for many, many years. And, you know, Irish practices around death are actually very positive. There's a real observance of being with the body and the mourning process. And she didn't get any of that living out here in Australia and doesn't have a strong community. So that was another loss, and certainly showed up in this case study. And she's got breast cancer. So who's going to be there to support her? So she presented with suicidality, social withdrawal, constant tears, anger, increased alcohol use, and depression. Really a complex grief, to be sure. So she does have a strong faith, a family and culture back in Ireland, but not much happening here. She goes to church occasionally, but she's been withdrawing in recent times. So yes, that is something we could look at. So now, what the overall approach that I would take with Bridget is person-centered. That's certainly how I look at things primarily, and have for many, many years. The 4 tasks, I think, is a nice sort of container for how to look at the process that we would follow. And I've recently done creative arts therapy, and would like to give Bridget the chance to express, you know, creatively what's actually going on for her. And then rituals are very big in Irish culture, and throughout cultures around the world. We seem to have lost many rituals around how to be with bereavement, how to be with loss in general. So we'll be looking at that. Now, the other things to note were that, you know, attachment comes up a lot in loss. Obviously, if you have an insecure attachment style and then you lose your person, it can really take you back into childhood wounding and core script or schema. Because of the alcohol consumption, we need to consider an AOD-informed approach. Post-traumatic growth is something you might not necessarily think about, but if we can hold that sort of possibility of, you know, growing through the pain, becoming more resilient, becoming more empathetic towards others, then that can instill hope in the process. And certainly Bridget could do with some emotional regulation and distress tolerance exercises, which we would look at in sessions. So here's what would be happening specifically. It would be about creating the therapeutic relationship in the first session with very deep listening and allowing her to feel these really big feelings that she may feel others, you know, are not welcoming, that she may be struggling to be with. Yeah, I think that the tissues are going to be right there. And there may be anger. There may be anger. It may be directed at me. It may be directed at others. So just allowing that to yeah, allowing that to happen, drawing out the 5 Ps, particularly the protective factors, normalizing and validating, and really helping her, again and again, just acknowledging the complexity and depth of what's happened and happening, being with Bridget to understand her meaning. Yeah, just really sitting with her inside, what it means for her at this stage in her life to be going through all of this. And it's going to take time. And I would want to be very clear about the fact that I'm there to support her within whatever my agency or other context is, and to be really clear about what that looks like in terms of availability and where to go if she's in crisis and what other supports are there. So I'm not carrying too much, but I am being clear in my commitment as best I can. And because of the attachment aspect, it's very important to not promise something that you can't offer, because she's already in a very deep attachment trauma with, as it became clear, evidence of early attachment wounding. So, of course, in the first session, I want to instill hope in her through looking at her strengths, looking at her stories, looking at the stories of others that I have worked with, that I know of, so that she can see that, her situation is unique, but that others have come through. There'd be some psychoed around the 4 tasks, just to kind of look ahead at the journey we might be going on. And I mean, I think I just feel into that very carefully, because I don't want her to feel like she needs to move on at this point. Early on, we're just sitting with the, just trying to help her be with the reality and building the therapeutic alliance. But over time, it may be some psychoed around emotional regulation. 4 tasks and other things would be useful, whether that's handouts or access to online videos and books. First session, I'd want to get some sense of a small achievable goal for her to gain back some control, which she would be feeling, that she'd completely lost through this just constant process of loss. Reconnecting on the phone, face to face with anybody that might be available to her, maybe through the church, and maybe just starting to tease out, over the first session or 3, interests that Bridget might have that she could perhaps just engage with in some way, just to sort of start to live a little bit more outside herself, outside of her pain. Yeah. And then yeah, those interests would look for something creative there that she can do with her hands, and hopefully something being in her body, exercise, yeah, just being on her feet, being in her body. We definitely need to get a safe plan happening around the suicidality, and make sure that she's got Lifeline, whether she's used it or not, just really normalizing that and letting her know that they're there 24/7, talking about my own experience and confidence in the service. We'd do some breathing exercises really early on, and just start to look at what she can do to help down-regulate when required, or up-regulate, using temperature, cold shower, movement, yeah, yeah, things like that. Regular counselling, I'd be looking to get her booked in for weekly, and then possibly fortnightly. And I would be not predicting, it's indicated that there'd be sort of 12 to 16 sessions. That would be going into the, the sort of the case, the case notes and discussion with my supervisor. And then we'd look to, explore rituals for completion and remembering linked to Irish culture. So that would draw out from her what her meaning is and what sorts of rituals might be appropriate for her. And through that, the creative aspect could come. So early on, I'd like to do some very simple exercises with some simple materials, maybe some clay, maybe some paints, to look at what the feelings are. I should have mentioned that early on in the feelings end of things. Yeah, and remembering anniversaries and special times and times with her children. And then when the kids come back, perhaps, involving them in some of this. And then I mentioned before the psychoed. So that is it, other than to say this was shared with me by a friend who has experienced many griefs, many forms of grief, and is also actually a mental health professional. So she has seen it from both sides. My grief doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be witnessed. It needs to be heard, felt, seen, honored, and ritualized, not fixed. It can never be fixed. It is not a problem with a solution. It's not a disorder with a cure. It does not go away like people think it does. You don't magically go back to who you were after you've finished grieving. And that is why the work around post-traumatic growth is so inspiring. And I would want that to be, woven into the whole approach from the beginning, to see the possibility alongside the 4 tasks. I hope this has been interesting. I wish we were here to do some questions, and all the best going forward in your practice. Thank you so much. And I'm still trying to work out how to turn it off.